365 DNI, or 365 Days, is a Polish erotic drama film adapted from a book of the same name written by Blanka Lupinska. The premise itself is pretty simple. A Sicilian gangster billionaire named Massimo kidnaps a woman, Laura, who has a profession established yet unknown and never mentioned again for the remainder of the movie. Anyways, he drugs her, abducts her, and informs her that he'll be holding her for the next 365 days of her life, during which he's hoping she'll fall in love with him. Laura resists at first, but it's in a very playful, non-threatening way, and eventually she adapts to her situation through shopping sprees, 5-star hotels, and an impromptu dip into a public fountain. Then some imaginary mafia threat comes into play. She goes home, he pops back up, they get engaged, then the movie ends on a cliffhanger where we're led to believe she was killed by a rival mafia. So there's lots to unpack here. This movie has garnered a massive following despite having all the makings of being extremely problematic. One reason, perhaps the most harmful, the issues and ambiguity around consent. The main character, Massimo, is a rapist. It's not a matter of opinion, it's a fact. If you don't believe me, go look under the movie's ratings on Netflix. You'll find the term sexual violence. Even the streaming service thinks so. Though Massimo tells Laura he won't do anything without her permission, he sexually assaults her multiple times. He gropes her in multiple instances and actually sticks his hand down her pants while she's restrained without her consent. The movie is smart in framing her reactions to these assaults ambiguously. To the audience, it would appear she's aroused, so what he's doing has to be okay, but it's still assault. The same can be said about the oral sex scene in the beginning of the movie. Massimo all but forces himself on a stewardess in another instance, but because she smiles afterwards, it's okay. These encounters only serve to feed into his narcissism and delusion that women are sexual objects to be used, forced into submission, then discarded. This isn't the first movie to experiment with our warped obsession with dominant, sexually violent men. Can't forget 50 Shades after all. But the success of 365 Days suggests that 50 Shades, its themes of dominance and violent sexuality and celebration of toxic masculinity, isn't just an anomaly. There's a massive audience that salivates for this kind of content, and no doubt we'll see other writers and creators trying to cash in on this wave in the near future. And why not? The formula itself is easy enough to replicate. Find a violent sociopath, make him dominant, extremely wealthy and good looking, and pair him with a sexually repressed or unsatisfied woman who's independent to a very small degree, not enough that it would be a problem. Come up with a plot that's really just a way to get characters from sex scene A to sex scene B, and you got yourself a hit movie. And 365 Days is definitely a hit. It's peaked at #1 in the US on Netflix and has remained in the top 10 since the week of its release. So then men come into the conversation, real world men as well as many feminists, and they can't help but ask, what the hell is wrong with people? This era of Me Too and Time's Up has greatly weakened the societal assault on women in the personal and professional spaces. Over the last few years, we've seen a kind of purging of the wealthy, influential men who have used their power and money to exert control over women, a cultural shift that has taken down some of the biggest and most powerful moguls in the world. The message is clear. No one is above the law, and no one is above accountability. We're reevaluating the way we approach gender in the workplace, the power structures that allowed these men to operate with autonomy in the first place, and in general advocating for the freedom and equality of all women. So the sheer popularity of this movie, the glamorization and desirability of a sexually aggressive character like Massimo, baffling. Mostly because he and this movie represent the complete opposite of everything the movement stands for, everything the 21st century feminist stands for: autonomy, agency, and freedom. This is a movie where all of that is taken from a woman by a wealthy, powerful man, and not only does the character Laura come to love it in her playful defiance of him, but the female audience loves it too. Like a lot. It's frustrating and very hard for men to understand. Massimo is a character who is able to operate in his world freely without any consequences. He's a character who gets away with being misogynist and abusive because he's rich and good looking. Not only does he get away with it, he's rewarded for it. Sound familiar? It should. But men, before you start assuming that women secretly want to be choked, let's discuss a few things. Now, there are a few possible explanations as to why characters like Massimo and Christian Grey garner such fascination. Explanations, though, not excuses. The answer lies in one of the things that we all have: fantasies. Though most women won't admit it, there's a large portion of the female population with the same fantasy, temporarily having their agency taken away by powerful, wealthy, beautiful men. The first and most vapid of reasons, the lavish lifestyle. You may notice a lot of these movies have the quintessential shopping spree: the luxury car that appears in the driveway, the whisking away to a foreign land, the instant access to unlimited wealth, the effortless elevation to a higher social class. There's a reason why these movies are always shot the way they are, with the sweeping landscapes and the pop music and the glamorous wardrobe choices. Visually, this imagery helps to sell the fantasy. The other more complicated reason lies in the distinction between fantasy and reality when it comes to the complex topic of sexuality. Though very few will outwardly admit it, there's a very large segment of the population that occasionally indulges in this somewhat shameful fantasy every once in a while. But not shameful in terms of wild, uninhibited sex. Part of the New Age feminist agenda is ridding the world of the restrictions and expectations that we place on female sexuality. What's shameful is the part where women actually want these men to use their aggressive sexuality to take their power and agency away, even temporarily. As New Age feminists, this is not something we're supposed to want. This is something we've spent decades telling the world we don't want, and we don't. At least not in the real world where we have to exist and operate in every day. But the cinematic universe? Different story. Think about hit movies like The Purge or Edge of Tomorrow, or even television shows like The Walking Dead. No one really wants to live in a world that frees convicted criminals, or one in which natural disasters obliterate modern civilization. But audiences enjoy these movies because they can observe this world completely devoid of law and order from a safe, detached distance without actually having to face any of its consequences. A world where, ungoverned, we can see characters reduced to their baser instincts. In reality, very few people would be mentally and physically equipped to survive in these worlds, but it's nice to indulge in the fantasy. Apply that same logic here. The success of 365 Days is expected. Despite having these problematic fantasies, most women know the only way a relationship like this works is actually in movies. That's why they're fantasies. There's no way any kind of relationship, romantic or otherwise, with a character like Massimo could ever be healthy or safe. Not in real life. In real life, there's no way a relationship with a man like this will be without serious violence, and not the sexy, ambiguous, she kind of likes it and if she doesn't, I can make her like it kind of violence that we see here, but the kind of potentially lethal violence that defines abusive relationships. If the success of 365 Days tells us anything, it's that most women understand that some things are better left to fantasy. Audiences that propel these kinds of movies into the mainstream are simply indulging in a fantasy that they know could never translate into real life. Just like the end of the world fantasies, crime fantasies, and so on. The intention is never to glamorize aggression or misogyny, but to be transported into this imaginary cinematic world where some of these qualities that women are sexually attracted to in characters like Massimo can exist independent of the extreme physical violence and emotional abuse that would realistically characterize a relationship with any man like him. Everyone has a right to explore their fantasies so long as it's not harmful to others. Creatives should be able to depict and explore the taboo as they see fit. After all, the very essence of art is an interpretation of life. But we have to be responsible about the messages that we send to the rest of the world, as well as the culture that those messages may be enforcing. Why don't we start by expanding the conversation down below? Thanks for listening.